Hello, and welcome to Research the News. As always, we are going live. So if you're watching this on the audio version the next day, just know that we're not editing anything. So everything you listen to will be the same thing that you missed out on by watching the live feed. But you should watch the live feed because it's fun, and you never know what kind of crazy stuff is going to happen. It's wild. All right, I'm going to bring on my co-host here, Gretchen. Gretchen, welcome
Hey,
to the
Ray.
show. How are you?
Good. I'm tuning in from upper state Pennsylvania today.
Nice. We're at your mom's house, right?
I'm actually at my brother's house where the dogs
Oh.
are not.
Fancy. Well, I tried to get Gretchen's mom to guest star this week, but she wasn't able to make it. So, all right. So last week we talked about Asian race relations with Andrew. I really enjoyed the conversation. I thought it was really interesting. I also saw something that was kind of cool this week. I haven't told you yet this, Gretchen, but I looked up the analytics from the podcast. We were in 7 countries last week, just in the audio version.
Really?
Yeah, we had seven different countries downloading it. And actually Germany, I didn't realize this, but Germany actually is getting about 9% of our listeners are coming from Germany. So I guess it might
I
be
love your country. I love your country.
Thank you, Germany, Deutschland. So if you want to check out all of our other episodes, our old episodes, you can check out researchthenews.org, which is newly redesigned this week, hopefully easier to see all of the information we have. Researchthenews.com has all of our links as well. And this week we added a YouTube Easter egg. Happened to do it on Easter Sunday. It wasn't planned that way, but we on Easter Sunday added an Easter egg for any subscriber to our YouTube page. So this week we're going to move into the topic at hand, which is disagreeing without hating someone. So how does that relate to Research the News? We discussed who should talk about this because we didn't want to disagree, and we decided that I will talk about it. So I think one of the reasons we started this podcast, when I looked at what was happening in society in general, it was just arguing and fighting and people hating each other, and people not able to have actual conversations. So Gretchen and I do come from very different backgrounds politically, but we've made it through 5 episodes and don't hate each other, which I think she was actually recruiting one of her old professors, a gender studies professor, for a future episode this week, and that was the word she used, and then I stole it because I think it's a good way to put it. We managed to not hate each other. But There's still times we've had hard conversations, and so that's why this week we're bringing on our guest, Hannah Perry Broadway, actually. Hannah, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Good. Yeah, glad to have you on the show. So Hannah is a licensed professional counselor. And when we were going through some of the warm-ups and when Gretchen and I were talking about this, all we kept hearing was, wow, this all sounds like marriage counseling. So I think that anyone who ever talks about politics together probably should go to a marriage counselor. So this is probably something everyone should do. But this week, Hannah's going to kind of guide us through. There's some things that we both want to talk about, both Gretchen and I. We have different ways of thinking about things. And then Hannah's going to kind of help us understand what is wrong with each of us. So is that what you're doing, Hannah? Is that the correct way of putting it?
Or I'm going to call out all the strengths you already have. Let's focus on the good things.
Okay. If you're fans of The Office, I'm a huge fan of The Office. I haven't mentioned it much on this show, but
No.
There's an episode where Jim and Pam are in counseling, and everything that's bad is an opportunity. So I appreciate you helping me have the opportunity to fix my issues or something. I don't know. But basically, every week we go through some of our biases, typically when we're talking about political issues. So things that we have leanings towards that may affect our viewpoints. And we also go through definitions of the subject we're talking about so people who are tuning in understand what we think about it. So this week, we decided to go through, and when we say what our bias is, we're talking about our way of thinking. And since I've just been talking for most of the opening, Gretchen, I'm going to let you start out with what your bias is and then what your definition of your way of thinking would be. So go ahead and you have the floor.
Thanks, Ray. So my way of thinking is more emotional based. I think I tend to not go into a super logical place. That's not the way my brain works. I tend to want peace and love and people to get along, and I hate confrontation. And so I know that these are things that have happened, like things that have come through my life in different ways, have experienced good because of it, and have experienced bad because of it. So I understand there are definite highs and lows with the way that I approach conversations with people. Knowing that about myself, social media does not lend itself well to my way of thinking. It's very hard to converse with people on social media when everything is cut and dry and there's no emotion in text. And I'm a very sarcastic person too. And sarcasm really doesn't fly on social media. So that in a nutshell is the way that I am. I'm very empathetic. And so my emotions definitely drive a lot of my decision making and conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And I tend to be a logical thinker. And I think that if I'm going through and explaining a definition of what that means to me, I'm going to go through a previous relationship, an argument that I had that made no sense to me. And I think this perfectly sums up my way of thinking. We were driving back from vacation, and it was the girl I was dating was in the passenger seat and her sister was in the back seat. And it was an older car that had the dual controls for air conditioning and heating. You could change the temperature on each side, but it wasn't the typical side where now you can just set whatever degree temperature you want. You actually had the main temperature set to a certain level, and then you had an adjustment down the other side that you could make it warmer or cooler. So we're driving, and the temperature was set. I liked it colder. She liked it warmer. So the car was set to cold, and her knob was turned all the way up to high. So to the high temperature. So it was adjusting where we were both comfortable. And then she proceeded to turn my temperature up and hers down. And I said, what are you doing there? I'm going to be hot. And she was like, well, I don't think that's fair. And I was like, what do you mean what's fair? And she was like, well, why does mine have to be all the way up? And I was like, well, that's because that makes you comfortable and it makes me comfortable. That makes sense because now we're both comfortable. And she was like, but why do I have to make the adjustments here? And I said, because, I'm driving the car. And in my head, all of these things made total sense. And I actually asked her sister, I said, are you following this at all? And she was like, no. And I was like, so before, what happened was we were both comfortable, and now you're comfortable and I'm not. So it's like, I'm not really sure what's happening here.
I don't really know
really
what was
mad.
going on there either.
Yeah. And later she actually brought up something to me, which it kind of made sense. I mean, she was like, okay, I realized that, what you said worked, but you weren't listening to what I was saying. And I was like, well, I wasn't understanding what you were saying. And so it didn't make sense to me. And I thought it was quite honestly pretty silly. And when I asked my friends about it, I'd say like, hey, what do you think of this? And be like, I have no idea. And so I think that's something where what I should have done, though, what I learned in conversation with her afterwards was it's not about, making sure that we're both comfortable it's asking her why she felt that way. And if I would have done that, then it maybe have helped the situation. So to me, logically, if we're both comfortable, let's keep it that way. What I don't often think is if you have a problem with that and it doesn't necessarily fit the fact that the solution is there, the problem is solved, why do we even have to talk about all of the emotions or why we have to? It just didn't make sense to me. So that, to me, logical thinking is the positive side of it is typically it makes sense and you get results. The negative is you're not often thinking about some of the emotional side of things. And I will add one more wrinkle to this. So I think something that I do have a little bit of a little twist on this is that personally I have some experience with alcoholism in my family. So children that have experience with that tend to be a little more empathetic. So I have this weird mix of I'm very logical, but also Gretchen sent me a text today that just said, oh, and I was like, is she mad at me? Like what? And I started trying to think of what it could possibly be. And it wasn't, so I have this weird mix from myself personally of maybe being overly empathetic sometimes with someone that I actually, want to know why. And then at the same time being too logical. So that was a very,
I think
long
I'm
intro.
the same way. I become way too logical. Like I'm going to get a little personal. My ex-husband, he would have these meltdown moments and I would just be sitting there and it was like all the time. So it was 10 years of meltdown moments. So I was starting to get really frustrated. And so I would just be like, what is wrong with you? Why are you acting like this? Like we've had this conversation and I became this logical, this doesn't make sense why are we doing this again? So I don't know. I wonder if it is something that is a little bit more fluid where you do float sometimes. I don't think anybody is legit separate brain, right? But it's like you have almost like a soft spot.
Yeah, there's an article that Hannah sent out today that talks about that. So now we can bring in the expert, now that we've talked about all of our issues and started getting it out there. There's a lot that we do actually want to cover, but Hannah, you're a licensed counselor. Is this something that you face often? And is this something, typically if this was a relationship, a male and a female, does it typically go along gender lines? Because that's something we talked about in our offline conversation. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on overall, is this a pretty common thing? And is there some truth to the sometimes controversial opinion that men tend to be more logical and women tend to be more emotional?
Well, what do you guys think? Seems like in your own relationships, you've noticed some truth in that in some ways.
Yeah. I always said that my ex-husband was the woman in our relationship, though.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting for someone who's progressive to say that.
Well, we would joke about it because he would become very emotional, but it was a joke because we were both very liberal. We would joke about it. But I mean, it's kind of interesting.
I think in my relationships, it's tended to be that way depending on where I was in life. I think when I was younger, I think growing up, I didn't have necessarily, I wasn't really sure of my role as a person in a relationship. I wasn't a very confident person in a relationship until probably my later 20s. So I think oftentimes before that, it's a little clouded. And there were times where I probably was I know I was too emotional in my thinking. But since then, I've tended to become probably the opposite of that. And I often get things after a relationship ends, like, you were the most confusing person I ever dated. And so it's a mix of logical conversation mixed with just not having conversation. So but anyway, this isn't about that was a good counseling move, Hannah. What do you guys think? But
that was awesome.
Jeez, I'm not going into my all right, I'm sure there's probably ex-girlfriends listening to this going,
I appreciate hearing from both of you because I think you guys represent most people out there, your viewpoints, and that I think what I picked up from both of you is that some of this more emotional side came out maybe when you were a little bit more unhealthy too. So, and maybe that's because you couldn't regulate it very well and it came out against your will too, or maybe examples with people you're in relationship with. So like Gretchen said, we have both sides, emotional and logical, and we need both sides, obviously, to make good decisions and balanced decisions. But I do think that we can tend towards one direction when we're not as healthy, but we kind of tend more towards the middle when we feel we're healthier, when we're in a safer setting, when we don't have to just cope to get by, but we actually can be mindful and be present in the process too. So
that makes total sense.
Different for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
One of the things I read in the article, I think it was the Good Therapy article, which again, these are all up on researchthenews.org. It said in there, I'm going to read it verbatim because I think what you're talking about now relates to this. It said, someone with a feeling response orientation is not inherently more able to feel or less able to think than someone with a thinking response orientation, and vice versa. These terms are used to address fundamental differences in the perceptual and experiential processes automatically triggered when individuals are sorting out and expressing what they're thinking and feeling. So I think going back to what you said, Gretchen, about social media, when I read that, I thought, social media is your initial response, and people typically see something and they get really angry. They have that response where I think oftentimes going away from the male-female response, that's sometimes a difference between kind of conservative thinkers versus liberal thinkers. And this is a gross generalization. But oftentimes you'll see conservatives be like, well, facts don't care about feelings. That's a common term. And liberals are like, well, you just hate poor people. And there's all these terms that go back and forth why the other side isn't understanding. And I think social media expresses those initial responses, which typically tend towards where you're thinking, where your style is. And I think that is just a unhealthy subject. So for me, social media is one of the most dangerous things in our country and in our lives. And I don't know. I mean, I think do we have a consensus there that social media is terrible, or
Yeah,
do
I
one
would
of
have
you two
failed out of
think?
school if we had Facebook when we were in college. Like, I would have failed out. Like, I know I would have. Like, it just would have been really bad. It would have
Yeah.
been really bad. Yeah, I don't know
And
how kids are doing it right now.
and Hannah, I mean, I think that's something where is that something you'll see if you have I don't know, if you're counseling a couple. Is it basically like everyone on Twitter and Facebook are just like angry couples yelling at each other at their worst cases and the emotions are coming out? How do you relate some of this political discussion that we're having back to some of these emotional versus logical thinking, or just being tied into like a certain perspective?
So that was a big question there.
I know.
Lots to
And I was
unpack.
actually kind of like two questions, so I'm really
Yeah.
just throwing it out there at you. So
So if we go back to just a couple and how they go through this conflict, conflict is not bad. So I think that's important to just get out there. Conflict is not bad. Being able to have conversations and definitely not necessarily agreeing, that's not a bad thing. But it's what we do with our conflict, how we talk through it, how we work through it. And I think social media doesn't give us a chance to work through it, right? Like we're just sticking something out there and it's stuck there. Like, then what do? Someone else sticks something there. It doesn't have a dialogue in it the way that we would in person, the way that you would with your partner.
Yeah.
So that's a huge piece that's missing from it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes though, we've kind of changed where I've seen people not be able to have conversations in person anymore. And I look at, I'm actually worried, especially for some of the younger generation, which I hate saying that. But I often see people that I worked, with high school kids for a long time, and through people in my life that are, younger. It's weird that you'll see them on Facebook or Instagram and they're just posting these things and they're very loud and they're just like fighting with people and they're arguing and they have all these points. And then you see them in person and it's like, hey, how are you? And it's like, good. And it's like nothing. There's just nothing there. It's really hard to be able to interact in person. And I think there's this wall that we build up where when you're online, if I'm tweeting at Gretchen, I don't ever have to see Gretchen again. I don't have to hear Gretchen again. I can block her if she says something I don't like, and then that conversation is dead. And I think oftentimes when you see that with kind of transitioning to real life, either one of two things happens. Either people are so focused on being able to be loud on social media, and then in person, they're completely different. I've seen that too, where some of my most outrageous Facebook friends that say, whether they're conservative, liberal, whatever it is, you meet them in person and they're just like really chill, calm people. But if you looked at their Facebook posts, it's like what Andrew said last week. He said, when we meet people now, the first thing we see is their most like outrageous bits of their personality on social media. And then we get to know about them. And that's kind of backwards. So I think that's a difficult thing. My second question that kind of we were talking about before is that, how much of this comes from, I think some of it is because it's faceless and nameless and we can kind of go after people, but there's also the cognitive dissonance where, if something is attacking my belief and something's coming at, if I believe something, it's almost like hurtful. And so is that something in one-on-one relationships? Is that something you often see where even if the other person is right, what level do you have to get to where you can break down that wall where, okay, it's not about being right. It's about, talking about feelings and vice versa for someone who's a logical thinker. And how much do you think that affects what we see happening online with people?
So yeah, we do need to do that in person. So like you said, we need to be able to get past just those walls we instantly will have up to be able to understand how the other person is feeling behind that statement. So when I see couples, a big thing I do is just teaching them how to actively listen to each other, which is something that we kind of take for granted sometimes. Social media is not a platform for active listening whatsoever.
Yeah.
So it's not a good example of that. And maybe you didn't grow up in a household where there was active listening. So it's oftentimes something I'm teaching a couple, like what is active listening? How do you do it? So we could try that actually with an exercise if you guys are willing to try some active listening.
I think that sounds great. So let's do this.
Okay.
Let's do this exercise.
This is what I do with my clients. You might as well just actively do it instead of me telling you about it.
Great.
Okay. So let's have Gretchen start out by what is one thing that you want Ray to know that maybe it's been hard for you to tell him? You can just make this up.
I can make it up. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I actually wouldn't mind if you went real, just by the way. I mean,
I don't really know, actually.
Open
Wait,
discussion.
Okay, something that I would really want you to know.
Or something where maybe you've been upset with him, you haven't really boldly told him that, or like, oh, I hate that we do this.
Well, so this is actually like a weird thing about how...
You jumped on that a little too quick. That was, okay, no, it's totally fine. I want to hear it. Hit me.
Okay, it's actually kind of an interesting... We actually touched on this the other day, but Ray and I actually met through a dating app. So that's like that's weird, number one. Okay, so the whole dating app thing is weird anyway. But Ray and I met on a dating app like 2.5 years ago, and I actually was like, oh my gosh, like I actually could really like this guy. He seems really amazing. Like he's really, really cool. I want to get to know him. But I was like right out of the divorce. I still lived in West Virginia. It was really weird. So whenever I actually met Ray again, we met again on like Bumble or Match or something like that. And then we ended up going on a date, and our date was to watch the vice presidential debate. And
That's right. It was the pandemic. It was
we were in the pandemic. Like this was, and so it was like a big deal for me to actually even go see somebody physically. But the thing that we had touched on, we had talked about it very quickly when we had this argument, is that I do almost, it's very odd. I feel like we have a relationship. It's not like a romantic relationship, but it's this in the back of my head because we met on this dating app, that I have this weird kind of thought connection with Ray. Don't take that any kind of romantic way, Ray. I can see his little face changing.
It's okay.
His face is actually getting red. And anybody who's watching this right now, his face is getting a little bit red.
So part of active listening, though, is that we really just need Gretchen to talk now. And Ray, you really shouldn't really be saying much at all. So we're going to get to your part and your role next.
But yeah, I mean, that is just kind of an interesting thing that's in the back of my head. When we had the our little fight that we had, our little spat, I said that I thought that probably had a lot to do with my emotional connection to Ray, just because of the way we first met, and it was not romantic at all in nature because we were watching the VP debate, but in the brain was like, oh, this guy could totally be someone that I could date. And then when we got to know each other, and I think we both like really respect each other, but it just didn't go that direction. But it was just kind of interesting that it was in the back of my head when we first started this whole thing. And then that when we had that fight, it put it into perspective for myself. Like I was like, oh dear God, what's going on? Like what am I really thinking? So it's just kind of interesting.
Okay. So can you put it into some I statements of how that makes you feel? Like I feel.
There were moments where I felt uncomfortable. There were moments when I was making connections with Ray and my ex-husband. And so the issue that we did have was because of the way Ray was talking to me. It reminded me of the way that I was spoken to previously. We actually had it out. We really did talk about it, and we fixed it, I think. Mm-hmm. And we realized that we weren't listening to each other when we had the fight. But those were moments. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you just shared how you feel using your I statements. Good work, Gretchen.
Thanks.
So Ray, now as active listening, you can respond to her by just articulating what she just said to you. So not your own thoughts, not your own feelings about it, but just say, Gretchen, I heard you say this.
Gretchen, I heard you say that because of the fact that we initially started out through a dating app, which is more of a romantic introduction versus just a friendly introduction, that sometimes clouds some of the thinking you have. And I think that sometimes causes problems because it brings up, even though it's not a romantic feeling moving forward, it's still these kind of blurred lines, I guess would be a good way of saying it. And so sometimes that causes some issues with how we interact with each other.
Okay. And then Gretchen, you can tell him what you thought about that, if he was right or not.
Yeah, that was very much right.
Okay. Right. And how did that make you feel hearing him say that?
Good. Yeah, good. I think this is kind of interesting because this is kind of what happened when we had our talk afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
We really did both say, I didn't listen to you when you said that. And yeah.
Well, good
yeah,
work.
it's very cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then what we can do now is even saying like, what do I need from the other person? So Gretchen can say, going forward, I need you to something, and Ray can actually say what he needs as well. So,
oh man, what do I need? I need a car. No, I'm just kidding. I think I just need him to keep treating me the way he's treating me now. I think the way we've moved forward, after we realized that we weren't listening to each other, we both are paying a lot more to what each other are saying. We have stopped talking as much as we were at the beginning, and I think that really, really helped. We were talking 3 times a day when we first started the podcast, and I think that's when it was like, and I told him, I said, I feel like we have like a relationship. And when we talked about bringing you on, I was like, this is going to be like a couple's thing because, this is what it feels like. We're like a couple, but we're not romantically a couple. We're just a couple in a different way. But I think looking at the way we interact with each other, we are oddly a couple, though. I mean, when you think about it, we are working together. We're trying to put forth something in this relationship that is this podcast. So I don't want to say it's a baby. It's a dog. We have a dog named the podcast, and we're taking care of it together. And I think the way that we look at it going forward has been really beneficial, I think, to the way I've approached this as well. I was very intimidated. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this. So those of you who are watching, I appreciate you giving me the moments that I've needed to kind of get caught up for my brain and for my ease of speaking. And I'm not saying like a lot, which is really good. And that's been a big thing. But no, the things that Ray has done for me over the last couple weeks since we've had that talk have been really, really beneficial.
Okay. Ray, is there anything you want to add to tell Gretchen?
I think we covered this, but I do think, number one, just for people listening, the way you explained it made it kind of seem to me like we had some kind of giant blowout and we were screaming at each other.
Oh my God,
just to be clear, this is more of like why aren't you understanding what I'm saying?
Yeah, it was more just it was a frustration.
Just for clarification's sake from outsiders.
We were boxing in Ray's front yard.
I think that goes back, though, to the original thing we talked about with the emotional versus logical thinking, because I don't often feel comfortable if there's someone who I know is not a person who can have a difficult conversation. I just don't want to have it with them. Not because I'm afraid to, I know it's pointless. And so there are people in my life, my 2 best friends, we have some very difficult conversations and I enjoy it with them. And we have some really tough things we talk about, but that helps us all get better ideas of why we believe what we do and helps get us to a point where we understand each other better. And so for me, I would actually prefer to keep talking like we did. And when I say talking like we did, I think what you said about making sure that we understand how each other thinks and being aware of that is good. But having tough conversations for 2 to 3 hours a day to me actually sounds really fun. Like that actually, and that's something that we've learned is different about the 2 of us, because being able to like challenge someone and have someone challenge me for 2 to 3 hours, I'm all about it. And so that's where I feel like, I think it's good that we've had less conversation for your sake, but for my sake, it's actually, it's a little sad because I enjoy having someone challenge me in those things. And we even talked before about potentially having a research the news after dark or something where we just have those conversations posted because they're more challenging than what we've had with each other on the air, which I think goes back to what you said, Gretchen, when you were talking about how you don't like confrontation. I think that when we're on the air, sometimes you've erred to the side of being non-confrontational, where I saw more of the combative side of you when we were talking off air, which I actually really liked and you weren't comfortable with. So in a situation like that, Hannah, how do you handle it? So because that's 2 distinct styles where for her, it's better that we don't have those conversations. For me, I'm like, I kind of miss those.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's what you just did, listening to each other about the reasons behind that too. Because I think there's a lot of vulnerability in having those kind of conversations on the air. And so hearing the other person's perspective about why they're not willing to do that And then maybe on the other side, what is causing you to want to do that so much too? So it's learning from each other and hearing from each other, not forcing the other person to do something they're not comfortable with, but maybe challenging them a little bit and pushing them if that's what they need to.
Mm-hmm.
I like it. So maybe on Mondays and Wednesdays, we have argumentative calls. And then Tuesdays and Thursdays, it's the compromise. Again, if you watch The Office, it's option number 4. It's win-win lose. I don't know who's losing here, but
me.
Yeah.
We can finish this counseling beyond this. So if you want to go into something more.
Oh my gosh.
Gretchen, I think the question for you on that is, do you tend to find, so someone who's a logical thinker, do you find, and I guess actually both of you, have you seen, I think with my friends who are very logical people, those are the people I enjoy having conversations with because they really are challenging. Whereas the emotional side, I still enjoy understanding why people believe what they do, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and that typically doesn't change my mind. So if someone's saying, well, this is the emotion of it, but they can't back it up with facts, that doesn't often change the way I think about that thing. It may give me a different understanding. There's things that Gretchen has said on the show where I go, oh, now I kind of understand why people believe what they do, but that's a rare thing. And it has happened a few times with Gretchen, but she's also backed it up with some facts that either I can see or that are, studies, data, something along those lines where, I can think my co-founder for my company, we have some really difficult conversations sometimes. And I think eventually we'll have him on the show for something, but we actually tend to agree on a lot of things and we still find a way to potentially argue for 6 hours straight. And at the end of it, I feel like a better person. And I feel like he's taught me a lot over time. And it's very easy to have those kind of conversations and walk away and not hate him. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting because I never hated Gretchen or was like upset at Gretchen. I think for you, it sounded like you were upset at me. And for me, it was more frustration of, why aren't you getting this? It wasn't mad at Gretchen as a person. It was, why don't you understand this? So is that something that is typically the case when you have these differing backgrounds talking to each other?
Certainly. Yeah. Yeah. One person is completely thinking just completely differently than the other person. Or oftentimes you see one person coming forward and saying, I didn't know there was even an issue. Mm-hmm. Right? Because they didn't see it as a problem at all. Yeah. Whereas the other person kept kind of
pushing it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you definitely see that both ways.
And when you said that, I don't know your ex-husband, and I feel like he's been brought up a couple times, so I don't want to keep bringing him up. But when you said that I reminded you of him, what was it what kind of situation what was I saying that reminded you of him?
Well, okay. So sometimes I would say something in passing and it would turn into this confrontation and I wouldn't understand. I didn't understand what was happening. And there were moments where I just felt like he just wanted to fight with me. And I hate fighting. And I'm naturally a very happy person and I don't like feeling low. I don't like feeling sad. I don't like feeling angry. And usually when I go to an angry place, I go there. So it's like, I try not to go there. A perfect example is about, I don't even remember how many years ago. I think it was like 2007. A guy jumped on my car in the middle of Pittsburgh, like jumped on it, like butt plant into the hood, turned around, looked at us in the window, scurried up onto the roof and like was jumping up and down. And I like blacked out. I got out of the car and just lost my brain, screaming and freaking out. And the emotional part of me, there was no logic. Like I was like, this guy could kill me. No, didn't even think that. Jumped right out of the car and like threatened his life. Like, and it's like me, happy little Gretchen. Why in the world would I do something like that? It was the only time in my life that's ever happened. But when I know that about myself, so whenever I would have these moments of being pushed to the place where I felt like someone wanted me to get heated with them, I will pull back and almost shut down because I don't want to physically allow myself to go there or mentally go there. It's scary for me. Not that I think I'm going to like lose control and murder someone. Like that's not it. But I've also taken personality tests. I'm a dancer and I went through a rehearsal process where he wanted us to take, a test to find out what our personality was. And then I found out my worst case scenario of my my personality was not like murder or suicide or anything like that. It was just like a person just completely melting. And I knew kind of that about myself. If I ever did get that low or that upset, that I would just need people to take care of me. And which also I hate that moment in going through the divorce and feeling like I had to ask people for help was like one of the worst things I ever had to do because I didn't want to feel helpless. So these are all things like in my psyche that I've gone through therapy and figured all this out about myself. But so now it's like when I have these moments and why I've really taken a step back from social media and having conversations that are difficult with people, especially in a medium where you cannot converse easily, is because I don't want to make myself sad or upset on purpose. It almost feels like it's on purpose. I'm doing this to myself instead of like having it organically happen. So I think whenever I am talking to people, I tend to, I talk to all different kinds of people. Like I don't like cherry pick like, oh, you're really nice, I'm just going to talk to you. But I don't go very deep into conversation. Like I can actually talk about my next door neighbor who is a Trump supporter and is very super duper duper sweet, makes me pierogies all the time and is like wonderful. And my dogs love her and we hang out in the backyard, but I don't go into deep conversations with her because I heard her talking to somebody one time and it was like, oh yeah, we can't go there because you're going to get super heated and I don't know what to do with that, So, those are the things that I know about my own mental health and and we use the word trigger, which anymore people use it like a swear word, and it's such a real thing and it's not something to make fun of or make fun of people for. We all should be understanding of how people react to things that are happening to them or things that are being said to them and be mindful of that. But that's what I know about myself.
Well, and I think something you said there towards the end, I think it triggered me a little bit. I actually don't think that I'm not actually triggered, but what you're saying makes total sense. And I think what Hannah was talking about earlier, understanding where we're coming from, I don't see hard conversations. Again, I think it's a different perspective. If I can have a hard conversation with someone, that means that I respect them enough to have that hard conversation. Yeah. Or it's someone that just is annoying me enough that I'm going to have that conversation. I could do that in public a lot. If it's someone I want to see where they're coming from. I can't. And I just want to be able to ask questions, understand where they're coming from. But to me, I see that as a sign of respect almost, because if I can go that deep, then that means that I trust your opinions. You see that as let's step back because I don't want to deal with that. So that's an interesting dynamic there.
I wonder.
But I think what you said about the triggering part is something interesting that I feel like this is a place where y'all can help me too, because so far it seems like I feel like I am in a counseling session and it's good. But when you say the word triggering and people use that as a swear word, there's a big difference sometimes in how people use that. And I think there's a misunderstanding that comes from just not, as I've said many times before, not recognizing the legitimacy of the other side. I think that being triggered by something is a completely valid thing. And when you said that, I was like, oh, I understand why you're saying that. And I can understand how that'd be frustrating. What I think from the opposite perspective of that, sometimes from someone who is a more logical thinker, when you hear triggering for things that you just don't understand why they're triggering, and even that we should have the initial response of, oh, well, tell me more. And then say, okay, tell me why that's triggering for you. And sometimes then I've been in situations where people are like, I just can't talk about this. And then they say why, and it just makes no sense why you wouldn't be able to talk about a specific subject. And it's kind of like, all right, well, I'm not understanding this. And so to me, your way of that version of you being triggered is not valid in my mind. And I think that's a bad thing. But where is that line? I'm going to ask both of you that, because there are some things, like if I told you guys right now, if you said something that, you're triggered, if I said to you, I'm triggered by the fact that you're wearing a white jacket, that's an extreme example that's pretty ridiculous, but I think you'd be like, well, why? And if I just don't like white jackets and there's no reason behind it, would you still be like, all right, I'll take off the white jacket? Or like, what's the right mode there?
I'd probably want to know more about what happened with you in a white jacket.
All right. All right.
I think for me, whenever people use the word triggered, it's never the person who's actually triggered. Like they're not saying, I'm so triggered. It's like, I don't enjoy this. Can you please stop it? And then people make fun of them by saying, oh, you're triggered. Oh, she's just triggered. And then it's like this way of making people feel invalid for their emotions or their feelings about a situation. And that's why I say people use it as a bad word. It's not like the person actually saying, like, I don't like this. It's making me really uncomfortable, or I don't, I'm having this emotional reaction to what I'm seeing or experiencing. It's the people that are putting them down and trying to make them feel like they are less, which is also comes into my whole emotions. I want people to be loving and happy and care about each other. But I think that's why I'm triggered by people saying things that, making people upset about it, because I think that was always something that happened to me. I always was made to feel like my emotions were not valid. And if I was experiencing emotions, I was just supposed to get over it and be my happy self and not be upset. Gosh, my dad died and I was supposed to just turn it around and be me. And so, these are things that are real things that people go through. And I think whenever, even just like what you said, Ray, like, yeah, if somebody's just like, I just don't like it. And it's like, okay, well, you don't like it, but why? But I think that's the conversation. Nobody cares why. People are just so easily to write off people when they're talking about things that bother them. They're not giving people a chance.
And I would agree that it happens. And I think on the flip side, though, again, something you said there when you said you just felt like you're just supposed to get over it, that makes sense to you from an emotional perspective. But from someone who has a logical perspective on things, it's kind of like, well, it doesn't, I often hear things like, it doesn't matter why people are upset. They're just upset. And in my mind, it's like, no, that doesn't make sense to me. And I'm told to get over it because what I'm told, and I think it's a valid, if someone's upset about something, you should try to figure out why. But if it doesn't make sense, and I think this often goes either on a macro level into like larger conversations that we have about politics, and on a micro level into one-on-one relationships. But I think it's really tough to hear. So it makes sense to you. You should just, you don't want to have to feel like you get over it. And I would say that, like a death in the family, you should take as much time as you need. And that makes sense to me and I understand it. But if it's something I don't understand, then the flip side happens when people are like, well, you just doesn't matter why, just agree with it, or just, and I've heard that in relationships specifically with, it doesn't matter why I believe this, or it doesn't matter if I'm right. The same person who, we had the car knob discussion with told me one time in an argument, I just hate arguing with you because you just make sense. And I was like, I don't know why that's a problem. That was an actual quote that I was both proud and upset about.
She seems like she was going through some stuff.
Yeah, I think so. But
Hannah, is this like something that like does really happen, like with people, like in larger terms, like how people converse with each other when it comes to this kind of stuff?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you guys are doing it right now. It makes sense. I think what's important to remember is that we are all responsible for our own stories, and that's it. So I relate a lot to what you were saying, Gretchen, about other people making fun of triggers and that being upsetting the most to you. Yeah. Because Ray, if you tell her like, you're triggering me by wearing that, then she will ask why and tell me more. And I'm here for you. Like, I will take this off because I care about you. But if you say, I can't see you wear that and I'm not going to tell you why, she's not going to respect you as much for that. And that's actually not going to develop more of a relationship. So I think we have these opportunities to go through conflict and talk about it. We're not going to resolve it, but we can process through it together and figure out how to talk to each other in open, honest ways. Or we're shutting it down and it's closing these doors. It's putting up walls. And even if someone is highly emotional, even them expressing emotion, we think, oh, they're being vulnerable by expressing emotion. But if they're not willing to open up a little bit more than that, they're putting up a wall as well. The same way someone can put up a wall with logic and be stuck in that and say, I'm not listening to you. This is the truth. That's it.
Yeah.
it goes both ways.
Yeah.
So is there any hope in social media or public discourse to be one other article that you brought up, which is again on the Wikipedia page, the Fast Company article. Now it related specifically to marketing and brands.
Yeah.
But they said when our emotional desires begin to shift towards a prospective brand, we align our reasons to be consistent with that intention. Our critical mind is always looking for evidence to support our beliefs, and the stronger the emotion, the stronger the belief, and the greater the tendency is to seek out supporting evidence. We are not rational, we are rationalizers. And so I think
So true.
it's very when I replace in those words from a perspective brand to a perspective political party, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, I just see that manifest itself so often where we just get signed up to a brand, and it's if one day the Democrats are saying that the police are bad, they're terrible. And then when something happens at the Capitol, it's like, no, we love our police officers because it fits the brand. And the reverse happens with Republicans in these situations. And we're just following that brand. And is there any way on social media to change these kind of things? How would you even begin? This wasn't the whole core of the conversation, but on a social media post, how is there any way? And I think the one answer could be no, there's not, to have a rational discussion online.
So I follow this one man on Instagram, and he talks about very just charged political topics. And his name is Carlos Whitaker, and he wrote some books on anxiety as well. And what he talks about, people are always sending him DMs about how, I can't believe you said this. I can't believe you did this. You're a horrible person. And his response to it, which I really respect, is he will just open up his camera and he'll actually send them a video right there of his face saying to them, hi, I see you, I hear you, thanks for sharing that with me. I don't agree with this point of this, but I agree with this point of it. Thank you. And so for them just to see his face interacting with them is actually like taking down a wall pretty quickly, because we can type to someone as quickly as we want to and be as harmful and as hurtful as we want. But face to face, like we kind of step back a little, just like you guys were talking about earlier. It's harder to say these things to someone face to face.
True.
So I like his response to that. Like
I love that
face to face.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked in our second episode. The first episode we had our first troll on Facebook or on Twitter or YouTube, I think it was. And I talked him down, and he ended up deleting his comment. But it was a nice interaction. But that actually took me probably 20 minutes back and forth. It was, to me, kind of a waste of time in hindsight, but I was like, well, maybe that person, maybe there's a little bit of change moving forward and they won't be so angry and volatile to begin with. But my initial reaction, though, I will say, was anger. Like I wanted to just write back and be like, okay, now let me tell something that's going to, make you feel silly and ridiculous. And I think that's what we often get caught up in.
Yeah.
And that's really what I'm afraid of. And that's what I'm hoping for with this show, is to be able to have these difficult conversations. And I think next week will be a good test for me. As I think we mentioned earlier, Gretchen has an old professor from West Virginia Wesleyan University.
Who's
a gender studies
of mine.
professor. Yep. And she seems like we probably have many, many different opinions on pretty much everything.
And
but
she is an absolute wonderful human being, and you cannot hate her.
I wouldn't hate her. That's the thing. She's opened herself up to coming out and the show, and I'm really looking forward to having these conversations. But
it's gonna be great.
I think it's easy when you're having these face-to-face conversations, even when you're on audio. If this was just an audio podcast and we didn't have the live feed, you can't really see even something as small as facial reactions. I've heard every statistic is made up, but I've heard like 80% or more of interaction with someone is through, body motion, body language. So I don't know what it is, but to me, it's a lot to be able to see how people are reacting to what you're saying. So I think that is really difficult.
Another piece is tone. So tone you would be able to pick up on a podcast, and tone is a huge part of it that we do not see in text with social media.
Gosh.
So basically, there's the sarcasm text that we talk about would actually be a good way to have tone.
I said, this is the thing. We were like, what's next? And I was like, somebody needs to make a sarcasm font, because it's just, it needs to happen.
The people who are listening live won't be able, or listening on the podcast won't be able to see this, but I often found I'm a pretty dry person and pretty sarcastic in general. And I remember one time someone was talking to me and they said, were you joking there? And I said, yeah, I smiled about it. And they were like, you didn't smile. And for those watching the video, it went from me saying something like this to doing this. And I don't know if you saw that really brief kind of like in my head, I thought my cheek was going way up and I had like a wink and it looked really, for those listening at home, it was like, I don't know, about a 2 millimeter increase on the right side of my face.
Yeah.
And I thought that I was being very plain with both my tone and with my body language. And so even in person, this is difficult. And I think online, it's pretty much impossible. Going back to one of the articles you linked, though, I think something I read here was talking about having difficult interactions in person, and they went through a few things you should do, including breathing, focusing on your body, meaning standing up and walking around when you are in a difficult conversation. It kind of breaks that tension. Acknowledging, labeling your feelings, and then taking a break, they mentioned, is just the biggest one. Let's take a break and come back to this. And I feel like that's something we should be doing before every social media post.
My gosh, yeah.
I wish Facebook had by default like a 10-minute time frame of once you read something, you couldn't comment for at least 10 minutes.
And then you can delete after you send something.
You can delete it, but you have to like wait and take a breath. And my Apple Watch pops up a thing that says breathe every 3 hours. And I feel like Facebook should say you're about to post something that's politically charged. Take a breath.
One of the best things that my therapist ever told me, because I wanted so badly just to tell him how much he hurt me and how much I hated him and like all these things. And she said, write the email, write it, don't send it, write it and then delete it, or write it down like physically on a notepad and then crumble it up, burn it. But you're getting those emotions out, because she's like, it's not going to make any difference to the person that's reading it. They don't care about you being mad, especially if it's something like I went through. But even on Facebook, you're just going to create a harder interaction. It's just going to be more difficult. You're not going to make that person happier by that comment. You're not going to change their mind by that comment. So what is the purpose, other than if you really are legitimately trying to understand where they're coming from, or you're trying to converse with them in a productive way? But even then, if you can tell the tone in theirs is like all capital letters and there's like fire in the background of their photo, like just don't. It's just it's not gonna end well. So I think that's the best thing. Type it and then delete it. And it's like you said it, but you didn't really say it.
Yeah, and I like the video from Carlos Whitaker. I'm going to look him up on Twitter and maybe invite him to be on the show. So I think that's interaction. Personally, though, I think one of the things that we talked about before we came on was we talked about being an active listener. We talked about men versus women and typically the emotional versus logical. I think one thing that is good for everyone that we mentioned before the show went on air, and you just brought up, Gretchen, was just mental health in general. And I feel like this is the time for us to have our first ever The More You Know, like they used to have on NBC, where the little star came across the screen. I actually, for the first time in my life, now Gretchen has been open about going to therapy. For the first time in my life, I went to therapy, and I've been going now for about 6-7 weeks, maybe 2 months. I don't remember, but I go every week. And the sessions are supposed to be 45 minutes, and we end up spending about an hour and 15 every time. So I don't know what that says about me as a human being, but there's a lot to work on.
You're making progress.
So, yeah. But I know initially I was very hesitant to talk about it. I'm not someone who likes to take medication in general. I like to do things myself. I don't want to take, when I say medication, I'm not talking about depression medication. I'm talking about like aspirin. I don't like taking that. When I had surgeries, I didn't take any of the prescription drugs. I'm just, let me take care of it naturally. And same way with my mental health. And I think that's been something that's been really good for me. And I think in general, we need more of that.
I agree. Oh my gosh.
I think the more I learn about myself and the more I learn about my issues, it's actually helped some relationships that I've had, interpersonal relationships. And I think it's something we just don't talk often enough about. So I feel like this is the soapbox time that, Hannah and Gretchen, you can talk about kind of your experiences with it and why you think it's important. Because for me, it's made a huge change. It's still new for me, but I think part of it is being one of the, traditionally, my grandfather was Irish Catholic, and he was always this tough guy, and never needed to go to the doctor, and just always this, he was the typical man's man, and I feel like I want that. And if there's, pain, if I have physical pain, I can handle that. But the mental pain, I feel like, is something that I pushed off for a long time and finally caved. And it's been really good. So that's my push for mental health, is that for those of us who are logical thinkers or trying to be tough, it really is an opportunity to better yourself. And have you, I feel like as a therapist, I'm sure you're someone who recommends someone going to see a therapist. Is that a correct statement? Am I
That
on
is a
base?
very correct statement. I go to my own counseling, even as a counselor. So I think that's really important. I think what you said, especially when you feel like you're a logical thinker and you want to learn more about yourself, you want to learn even what makes you a logical thinker or why you're running into these barriers with people around you and having the same conflict over and over again. That's a great time to go to counseling, help someone else explore that with you, get another viewpoint. Where I think the best part is that you're not required to do anything for them, right?
Yeah.
Like, as someone who maybe similar to Gretchen, like, I care about people. If I sit down with a friend, I will listen to them forever. And then at the last 10 minutes, I'll tell them about myself,
Yeah.
But counseling, you don't have to feel bad about not asking the person how they're doing too, and just spending the whole hour and 15 minutes talking about yourself, getting that help. Because when else do we get to do that in a week? And pausing that long to actually dig into some stuff, like, definitely recommend it.
Yeah. I think for me, I pushed off. It's funny because Ray, I think I might be a lot more logical than I thought. I was I wonder if it is really like society's way of telling us, like, if you go to therapy, you're weak, like this whole don't be weak stuff that's constantly pushed on all of us. And I think a lot of it was how I grew up. My parents were both very strong individuals. My mom just took the weight of the world, it seemed. My dad, I never even saw him cry until I was in high school. And I was like, what is happening? So it's like, and you idolize these people and you're like, they didn't need help. Yeah. But then I realized, yeah, they did. And then, and I didn't realize that until I was an adult. But going through therapy, when I finally decided to go, well, and it wasn't like I decided, I was like, oh my God, I have to go. Like, I have to go. I think I'm going to melt. Yeah. So I was like, it is time. And I wish that I would have gone. I wish I would have gone sooner. It's just when you go through things and you, even in like a situation where you don't know if the person that you're talking to is really listening to you, having that person that is their job to just sit there and help you figure it out. That is so liberating. And I remember telling my therapist things that I'd never even told my husband about the way I was feeling, or things that had happened in my past that were kind of bubbling up, and realizing that things that had happened to me really changed the way I looked at the world, and understanding that now makes so much more sense and I can make better decisions. So I think the thing that we need to move past is the stigma of it, and understanding that it doesn't make you weak. It actually makes you stronger. It makes you so much more powerful, and understanding that you have the power to change your life and to change your decision making. And it is an empowering thing to go to therapy, and you cry and you get it all out, and then you leave and you're like, oh my gosh, this was amazing. Or you're like, I need to go to Lowe's and buy another plant because I just need to go, or go buy ice cream today because that's just where I need to go. But in the days following, you just realize how important it is. Now I'm like a super advocate. I'm like, my friends, if they're like, I can't figure this out. I'm like, you need to go to therapy. Like, it's like, you don't understand how much it's going to help you. It really does. So, but the stigma part of it is the big problem.
Yeah. And I think that's something that everyone should be able to get behind. I think people who are emotional thinkers should be able to get behind that. And I think it's often interesting to me when we've had a few shootings recently, the mass shootings, and oftentimes it comes up about mental health, and it seems like whenever there's a shooting, people who are liberal tend to want to get rid of guns, and people who are conservative talk about mental health, and then it fades away and nothing ever happens with guns or mental health. And I think, to me, the more damaging one of those two is the mental health, because personally I think this is a complete side topic, but I am a gun owner, and I couldn't shoot. I went hunting once and I couldn't shoot a deer. I actually had a chance to shoot a deer, and I couldn't do it. I'm not a vegetarian, but I couldn't do it. I physically couldn't. So anyone who could kill a human being, there's something
There's
wrong
something
there,
wrong.
clearly.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that we should be talking more about in general, because I think that's something when you look at any shooting, whether it's a mass shooting, whether it's individual, whether it's murder, rape, all these things lead back to some kind of mental problem. And it seems like it only pops up when it becomes a dialogue that we can use as a defense. Well, it's not the gun, it's mental health. I actually agree with that, because the core of it is the mental health of the person. The gun didn't do it, the person did it, but we never actually changed anything with it. And just like you said about being an advocate, I've actually had 2 friends that have gone, and I think I hadn't told many people about this at all, but at first I think I told 4 people, and of the 4 people I told, 2 of them went to counseling, and one of them specifically said, if you went, I felt like it was, if you actually broke down that barrier, then it was something I felt like I should do. And they said it was very helpful. But we don't, and I think there are people that I have talked to since then that have said, oh yeah, I go to therapy. You know, Hannah just said she goes to therapy. I didn't know any of this stuff, but we don't talk about that. And on a plug from just, if you have medical insurance, my appointments are like $5 a piece, so it's not even that expensive if you have good health insurance.
I in West Virginia, right when everything happened and I started to go, I was like 4, because I went like every 2 days. It was like 2 days, every 2 days I was going in. And I ended up getting a bill, and here my health insurance wasn't going to cover any of it. And so then it was this like pile on. This is where
we're trying to talk people into it, so don't tell the bad stories. Yeah.
No, well, this is the thing. Like, obviously make sure with your health insurance company. But know this though too. When they found out, my therapist, when they found out, they were like, don't worry about it. We're going to help you. We're going to figure this out. You can pay what you can. And I was like, what? It's like go into like a concert in like an old loft, and they're like, just pay what you can, you know? And it's like, okay, $3, $5, you know? And I was like, I don't know what that means. And she's like, you pay us what you can. You just tell us what you can pay, and that's what you pay. And I was like, okay. And I was single, I had a house payment and all this kind of stuff, and dogs and all that. So I was like, okay, I can afford this much. And they were like, okay. So, I mean, that is something to know if your health insurance doesn't cover it. Now I'm like, glorious. I get 2 free mental health visits every year, I think. And then like after that, it's only like $10. And I'm like, great. So, which I haven't taken advantage of yet, but I'm going to.
The first person I went to, actually, they didn't cover insurance. They checked, because I checked beforehand, and they told me they did. And afterwards they said, don't worry about it, that's on us. And so they didn't have me.
Yeah, they didn't take it.
And they actually even told me if I wanted to continue going with her since I started, I could go with her. But they had already set me up with someone else, and I ended up sticking with the second person. But they were very, I mean, I think it's almost like a fraternity or something. Once you start getting into the mental health field, people are there to help you out, and they realize you're trying to get better. So I think there is, I think that's something when we talk about what's next, for me, I think what you said, Hannah, about, society saying we're not strong if we get mental help. I think that's completely opposite. And I wish I would have done this a long time ago.
Me too.
So I think, Hannah's actually known me for 15 years now, 10 years. It's been a while.
Long time. I don't even remember when we first met. Sorry.
Yeah. So, I mean, she has seen different iterations of me. I hope I continue to get to be a better person, but I look back at younger Ray often and I go, what was I thinking? And even when I say younger Ray, that could be Ray from yesterday, because oftentimes I go, what was I thinking yesterday? But I feel like this would have been a big help a long time ago. So what's next for me is that we become more comfortable with mental health in general and start moving forward. So what do you guys have for what's next for and that could be regarding personal mental health, or that can be how we actually disagree without hating each other? Because I think that might be something good for you to wrap up, Gretchen, is how do we disagree without hating each other? Because we've gone through that. We've had disagreements.
I think the big thing is understanding that people think differently than you. They have different experiences that sculpt their worldview and the way they interpret what they are hearing, what they are seeing. Everything is on the individual level. And like Hannah said, you can only be responsible for your story. I think that's perfect because you cannot change someone else's view with your experience, unless your experience is like, whoa, this happened and wow, we should all pay attention to it. Obviously that's great, but you can't on the micro level change every little person to fit your own worldview, because that is just a crazy way to enter into any kind of conversation. Listening to people, understanding that their views make them who they are, and you should respect that. And at the same time, respect yourself enough to have a I shouldn't even say simple, a simplistic way of speaking to people so they understand where you're coming from, instead of getting mad or angry or combative. I think these are ways that we can all look at social media, not trying to infect as many people, but just sharing your worldview. I think that's what really is, because when people start understanding where you come from, they accept your opinions. But if you decide to just bark at the top of your lungs without any context, that's when people really shut down and they don't want to listen to you. That's really what I feel is the next step for social media, especially.
Hannah, any next steps for anyone as we wrap up?
Next steps for social media?
Social media and just disagreements in general. I think with all your experience counseling people, I mean, if you had, we didn't talk about this beforehand, but if you had a list of the top 3 or something you would say is the most important thing that people should understand, whether it's a disagreement about politics or just in life, what is the number one thing people should understand when they're having that disagreement with each other to help have a resolution instead of an argument?
I think Gretchen said it already, actually. People are coming from different perspectives because they have their own story. They have their own things that have shaped them, that have brought them to where they are today. So by just being with them, giving them some empathy for that, I think the way we can learn about people is by asking open-ended questions and not trying to force them into a corner or say, do you believe this or this? Say, what do you believe? Instead of putting them into a box. Giving them space to breathe, being okay with the gray area, not having it needing to be black or white. There's a lot in the middle there. So being able to talk about it, listen to each other.
That's great.
Well, I did have something else I wanted to talk about that I mentioned earlier about seeing if Gretchen agreed, but I feel like we're coming up on time. So I think I'm going to skip past that. But what you just said leads into something else that I wanted to talk about, which was Charles Barkley. Charles Barkley, if you're not familiar with him, I don't know how you couldn't be. He's a basketball player and he's a commentator now. And he's a very plain speaker. And I think tying in what you just said with Charles Barkley, I think often too, I've brought this up before, but in most cases, the majority of situations, even with Gretchen and I, if we disagree on how we get to certain places, the end result is typically the same. So we may be disagreeing on policy, and people get so caught up in policy. And I think it goes back to what we're talking about, where we're not rational, we're rationalizers. And we try to rationalize all these things that are happening in the world into our worldview. And at the core of it, neither Gretchen and I, she does mention on the show often that she's very compassionate, and and she just cares so much. It's like the resume look, where it's, I care too much and I volunteer too often. But that's because her end goals, typically the entire process tends to be, let's see how we can make people the most comfortable, even if it's not necessarily the outcome that I would see, because I think if we're only going for comfort or what makes people feel happy in the moment, it's not always what's going to be the best outcome in the end. But that outcome at the end typically is always the same. We don't want to see people poor. We don't want to see inequality. We don't want to see any of these things. But the way of getting there is often different. And Charles Barkley this week was on the NCAA championship, and he said this thing. You can read the whole quote. It's also up on the researchthenews.org. But he said, I think most white people and black people are great people. I really believe that in my heart. But I think our system is set up where our politicians, whether they are Republicans or Democrats, are designed to make us not like each other so they can keep their grasp of money and power. They divide and conquer. And I think that is just the overarching theme. I do think eventually I would like to get into office, and mainly to blow up the system, and not in an anarchist way where we get rid of democracy and tear down the Constitution, because I think the Constitution's a great document. We've talked about it before. I won't go up my soapbox, but I do want to change the way people are elected and what people do once they get there. And right now, the entire system, every 4 years, we just have more division, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And it used to be every 4 years when there was a lot of press coverage. Now that we have social media, it's every day, and people just get more divisive. And the last stat I'll say about it, we talked about this before, but I think it's 90% of all media is owned by 5 companies, and even the other 10% are typically owned by, there's not local newspapers anymore. It's a conglomerate that owns 20 newspapers, and they're still not counted as one of those top 5. So there really is no independent journalism, and it's really frustrating, and there's no one to hold presidents accountable if they agree with your general party view. Journalism is unfortunately dead. And I think politicians and journalists right now, it's about a divide and conquer mentality, and I think Charles Barkley really nailed it. So with that being said, we're going to move into the good news from the week, which is also a controversial topic. Today, I received my vaccine. So that is very controversial to some people, and I did a lot of research. And this goes back to what we're talking about, where I think I had logical questions about how an mRNA vaccine had never been available before, but now all of a sudden it got pushed through. And when I asked certain people about that, some people would say, well, that's because it's, Bill Gates, or that's because and then some people would say, well, don't even listen to Fox News because they just want to ask questions. And it's like, okay, well, you should be asking questions. There are these things, I'm injecting something into me that isn't really technically tested yet. It's been tested and proven to be safe on the short term. 100% agree. But long term, we just haven't seen it. 95% of me thinks that that's totally fine, and I don't think there'll be any problems, but there's still 5% of me that goes, okay, we could have a long-term issue, which is why I went for the Johnson & Johnson, because it was one shot and it was the traditional vaccine. All of that being said, I think, again, it's recognizing the legitimacy of their side. And if you listen to politicians, President Biden's calling people who question vaccines Neanderthals, and Republicans are saying, don't even mask up and just do your thing. And these people are just trying to take your liberty. And the news organizations parrot it. And it's just so frustrating, because I do feel better now. I'm going to keep wearing my mask. I don't necessarily know if it's really helping that much anymore, but I'm going to keep doing it, because if it helps, great. But what we do every week is talk about a sponsor that we have. And it's a fake sponsor because we're too small to have a real sponsor. But this week, I don't know why, but right after the vaccine, I just started thinking about how great the Microsoft family of products are. And so I wanted to just say that we should all get the 5G and the Bill Gates. So thank you. I'd also like to point out that's a terrible joke. And I told it to my best friend today. If you don't get the joke, by the way, it's because the conspiracy theorists think that Bill Gates is injecting us with things. And the 5G airwaves are going to take us over because of this vaccine. And
Oh my God.
I told my best friend, and he's like, I don't get it. And so I had to explain it to him. And I thought it was just him. And so I told Gretchen, and she wrote back, oh. And I was like, well,
I didn't get it.
Is she mad at me? I just didn't get it. So it's a stupid joke.
I was like, you're just going to have to explain this to me later, because I don't know what you're talking about.
I hope there are some people that laughed at my
good.
stupid joke.
I got
So thank you.
I
Thank
chuckled
you.
inside, like I
Oh,
normally
good.
do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's more than I've gotten so far from that joke.
Yeah,
So I
that was
appreciate
good.
it. All right, so we're gonna wrap up now. Any last thoughts, Gretchen, Hannah? Anything you want to say before we wrap up?
No, I'm so happy you got your vaccine, Ray.
I am too. I feel good. I feel safer. So we'll see how I feel
Yes.
tomorrow. Apparently that's when the effects kick in. But
I get my second one next Saturday, so I'm like,
nice.
gonna be good.
Hannah, were you able to be vaccinated yet?
I am vaccinated. I also am promoting Microsoft products lately.
Nice. Yeah. It's those chemtrails. I mean, I will say, I eventually want to have some of the QAnon people and some flat earthers on. I don't, when I say that, I'm not mocking, because I think, I can't. Okay. I'm just going to say this to wrap up. I think that the one group that it's okay to mock, I think every group you can respect the legitimacy and try to understand where they're coming from. But flat earthers, I'm just throwing that out there. If there's any flat earthers listening, please feel free to call in, and we want to have you on the show someday, because with most conspiracy theories, I can see, okay, so if lizard people really do run the world, I don't believe that's happening, but I could see why they'd want to cover that up. Whereas something like the flat Earth, I have no idea why we'd be spending billions of dollars and all this time and having fake NASA liftoffs just to prove that I just don't know what the end goal is of that.
Yeah,
so please, flat earthers, you are the one group that I don't have. I can't even begin to see the legitimacy of your side, but I'd love to have you on so you can try to talk me into it. So, weird way to wrap up vaccines and flat Earth. So I
like it.
That's Research the News. Hannah, thank you for being on. I feel like
thank you, Hannah.
I went to my second counseling session of the week. I feel very good. So thank you for that.
Well, you
Gretchen,
guys seem to be
always,
a strong couple. So
thanks.
Oh,
there's
on
a future.
That, yeah, I am going to close this down by saying thanks for watching Research the News. Feel free to check out researchnews.com.org. And as we said before, the podcast will be posted up tomorrow. So check that out, and we'll see you again next week.